Hey troops, welcome to the channel Dit Commando. My name's Ryan, a former Royal Marine from the United Kingdom, and today we're going to be reacting to 3 scary true military stories. Going to get straight into this one, guys. Please like, share and subscribe. Let's go.
My dad served in the Vietnam War from 1960 to 1962. For the longest time, he didn't tell anyone outside of the family this story, but he's in his mid-80s now, and he doesn't care about me sharing it with anyone. Not that I intend to release any of our names. I've heard this story told by him 5 times now, and each time I learn about new details he hadn't mentioned the time before. He didn't like to tell this story for obvious reasons, I think. Not only is thinking back to any of those events probably traumatizing, but also he would always say he felt it would be an inappropriate family gathering discussion. My dad did a lot of things in the war. At one point, he was what was known as a tunnel rat, which was a soldier.
Man, these tunnel rats did some horrendous things. Guys, if you haven't seen what tunnel rats do, check out some of my videos on it.
Who performed underground search and destroy missions, usually in underground tunnels. My dad and 2 of his comrades were crawling through a deep tunnel, expecting to hit a booby trap or run into an ambush, but the tunnels were surprisingly empty and silent. My dad describes the experience of crawling through the silent, dark tunnels as bone-chilling and adrenaline-pumping, as the fear of instant death at any moment would linger. My dad and his comrades heard a faint yelling and crying sound further down the tunnels. It was of a woman. As they crawled deeper into the tunnels, the cries and screams became more clear.
Man.
And it was obvious there was a woman screaming for help. The 3 picked up their pace, worried of a potential hostage or a prisoner situation. As they continued to crawl through the tunnels, the cries for help got a little louder and clearer. They arrived to a small room that they could slightly get off their knees in. The ceiling was just high enough to half stand, half crouch. There was a small table with a lantern on it that was still lit. There were also 2 broken chairs and a locked safe box with some metallic objects that would rustle around inside the box when shaken. Aside from that, this small room was empty. However, the tunnel continued past this room, so they continued deeper into the tunnel, but the screams for help had stopped at this point. My dad described this horrible, familiar stench of death that soon became overwhelming in the tunnels. They entered one final room with no further tunnels. My dad still refuses to describe everything that was in this room in detail, other than there were multiple bodies, and they weren't killed by just bullets. They looked as though they'd been mutilated by some kind of creature. One of the bodies was that of a woman. The scene was so horrible that my dad and the 2 other tunnel rats had to turn around and flee. They had no explanation for what could have done what was seen in that room. On their crawl back out of the tunnels, they started hearing the cries for help from that woman's voice again. My dad says he and his comrades froze and looked at each other with wide eyes and obvious fear in their faces. They had made it to the end of that tunnel. There were no living things from there to the end of it, yet those screams for help were coming from the direction that they just were.
That is freaky.
They picked up their pace even more. My dad was in the back of the group of 3, and he says he would look back every 10 seconds, thinking he was hearing sounds from behind him, fearing he would see someone or something approaching from the darkness. They made it back to the surface eventually, and marked the entrance with a flag that signified to his team that the tunnel had been searched and cleared. Most tunnels would be interconnecting as a means of underground transportation and cover, but my dad says this tunnel was unusual to abruptly end.
That's horrendous.
He says it was easily the most gut-wrenching, horrific, nightmare-inducing thing he'd experienced in his entire 2 years in Vietnam.
Alright, so these type of things, obviously, you know, it's going to be a bad thing anyway, going into the tunnels as a tunnel rat. You're going to see some horrific things. Now, the mind can play tricks on you sometimes in situations as such, especially in the dark, in a tunnel, you're claustrophobic, you're in a war zone, you're fatigued, you've seen horrible things before, and seen dead people. It'd be easy to come to an assumption that, you know, potentially something else has done that to these people, but in actual fact, it's more than likely these have just been mutilated by humans, and that's the fact of it, alright? I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, or monsters and stuff. The true monsters of this earth are human beings, but let me know what you think about that in the comments.
My My basic training for the Air Force was at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. After that, I was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base for technical school, and after my graduation, I received orders to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. There, my job was aerospace mechanic at first.
Ooh.
I started on the night duty.
Now, every good horror story starts off with an aerospace mechanic.
Unfortunately, so my sleep schedule was basically non-existent. My duties basically were lugging plane parts like anti-ice valves, igniters, ignition exciters, sensors, and more from the warehouse to the flight line. It was for the most part boring, repetitive work, especially at night. A lot of sitting around and playing games on my phone, but nobody heard that from me. It had to be like 4 a.m. at this point. I was waiting for the other guy to come drop off some parts to the flight line. He'll be referred to as Mark for the purpose of this story. I was waiting by the back cargo area of the plane we were working on at the time, sitting on a box scrolling through my phone. Mark was taking an incredibly long time with his delivery, so I shot him a few texts. When they went unresponded to, I tried calling him a few times. The calls rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I figured he was either screening his calls, lost his phone, or was just very busy at the moment. I waited and waited, and he never showed up. Eventually I got a call from Mark's number, so I picked up, but it wasn't Mark's voice on the other end. It was some random guy. He sounded like a grown man in his 40s.
Nah.
He said he saw I tried calling a few times and said he found this phone on the ground outside of the base. I described what Mark looked like and asked him if he had seen anyone who may have resembled him. He said he had not. It's not like he would have been allowed on the base, so my only option was to drive out there and meet him. I asked him where he...
That's the question. Would you actually go out and meet someone under that kind of circumstance? I don't know, man. It doesn't matter how good a friend you are. If he's unresponsive and then someone else picks up the phone, I would be ringing the police. That's for sure.
He was, and he gave me the name of a nearby joint where I agreed to meet him. I walked to my car, which was parked in the closest parking lot, and I drove off the base towards the place he told me to meet him. While I was mid-drive, I remembered Mark was sharing his location with me. Long story, but we basically met these 2 girls this one night while off base who we separated from each other with. We, as a joke, started sharing our locations with each other in case we got quote-unquote murdered, as we kept joking.
Oh, man.
We joked about it mainly because we met them at a sketchy dive bar, but I'm not about to get into that. The place...
Right, dudes don't do that kind of stuff. Let me know if you do that. If you do, I don't know. Even in the military guys don't do that. I wouldn't have said anyway. It's not something I would have done. Shit, that's why I don't believe this story from the start, man. What do you think?
The man on the phone told me to meet him was called Tara's Tavern in Cookstown, the closest town to the base. I pulled up the location of Mark's phone and it checked out. It showed Mark's phone location right next to Tara's Tavern. This begged the question, what was that man doing there this late? At this hour the place wasn't open and there were 0 cars on the road. I pulled into the little parking lot and parked. I stepped out and called Mark's phone again. The guy picked up, and he spoke in a noticeably lower voice now. I told him I was in the parking lot of the pub, and he said he was as well. He said in almost a whisper, "I'll be right over."
Oh my
and
goodness.
he hung up.
This is
It was
horrendous.
weirder in the moment than it sounds explaining it. I looked at the location on my phone to see if it was updating, but it seemed the location of Mark's phone was in this small patch of woods about 200 feet long and 200 feet wide.
Don't do this.
I tried calling again, and it went straight to voicemail. I looked around the whole parking lot, but didn't see...
Right, you'd just get in your car, wouldn't you? Let's face it, you're not messing about in woods and stuff with a scary dude on the end of the phone. You're not doing that shit, period.
anyone. I was all alone. Not even an occasional passing car. I looked to the woods when I heard something over the sound of the crickets, like someone's footsteps. And then I saw a man. It was him. He was standing just behind the tree line between the woods and the parking lot. He called to me, "Are you alone?" And the sight of him, only his upper body visible, it was freaky as hell. I called back, "No, why?" as I inched my way closer to my car. This was one giant red flag. He called back, "Who are you with?" I didn't answer that.
Goodness.
I got in my car and drove back to base. I called my supervisor and told him Mark was missing and someone was hiding in a patch of woods with his phone.
That is
My supervisor told me he was with Mark at that moment. He told me to meet them at the small building by the flight line. I met with the two and told them once again what I witnessed when tracking his phone. Mark told me what happened. While off the base, he was approached by somebody outside of a 24/7 convenience store, asking for a ride back to the base. Mark believed that he was actually in the Air Force at first and let him in the car.
Oh, man.
As they were driving, the man asked Mark to pull over by the woods so he could pee real quick. Mark obliged for some reason. As Mark was pulled to the side of the road by the same small patch of woods by Tara's Tavern, he wasn't paying attention for a minute, and his door was opened by the man. Without a second to even react, the man was grabbing Mark's arms and squeezing them as he tried to pull him out of the car.
Jesus.
Mark said he kicked at the man's groin area until he let go. He dropped his phone and it fell out of the car during the struggle, but as he was free, he drove the car away with the door still open at first. And next thing that happened was he went back to the base to talk with our supervisor. We of course called the police and all went to Tara's Tavern to check if the man was still there. The location of Mark's phone was no longer popping up on the map. It's possible the man destroyed the phone. All we did was file a police report. Some people out there are actually crazy and dangerous. Who knows what he would have done to either of us if he had gotten us in the woods.
Right, so the beginning part of that story, I didn't really believe it, but the end bit, yeah, I can see that being quite plausible, actually. You know, maybe he's picked someone up. You think that in the military, I would have done probably the same when I was in the Marines, seeing a lad who potentially looks like a bootneck or a Marine. If I'm going back to camp, it's like, hey, do you want to lift? But you just got to be careful. You don't know who you're picking up, isn't it? And in this case, obviously, that guy's turned out to be a complete and utter nutcase. Story 3, let's go. My hands are sweaty.
During my days as a Marine, I had many different jobs on site, but my least favorite was graveyard patrol. At one point, I was one of the few with the overnight graveyard patrol shift for a nearby memorial cemetery. As you would imagine, it was a pretty slow shift with not much going on. Oddly enough, even though the cemetery was in a remote location surrounded by dense forest on each side, and I was working the literal graveyard shift, I found the job more relaxing than scary or unnerving. I would be the only one in the cemetery, and my relief would come around 4 a.m., which would be the end of my shift. So this had to have happened past 3 a.m., nearing the end of my shift. It was on this otherwise regular night that I was patrolling near the perimeter fence where some of the older headstones were. I wasn't allowed to be on my phone. If I were to be caught with my phone, I would be reprimanded. Even though it was unlikely to be caught since there was no one else really around except for me, I tried my best to follow that rule. So it was just a lot of walking around and looking at old headstones. But anyway, while patrolling past some of the older ones, I began to hear a woman's humming. It was this very calming, soothing kind of humming, only I wasn't calmed or soothed, because nobody was supposed to be in the cemetery, so it was more so a cause for concern. I started following the sounds of the humming. It was coming from behind this intentionally planted line of thick trees with vines and brushes sprouting from the sides of them. Instead of walking around the long wall of trees, I squeezed through the vines and bushes to the other side, cutting myself in the process. As I struggled to make it to the other side, the humming suddenly stopped as quickly as it started. I was left alone to the silence once again, not even the sound of a cricket. I walked closer to the edge of the memorial property, by the woods, near a few of the big mausoleum-looking structures, and I could distinctly hear some kind of buzzing sound coming from one of them. I stepped up the 3 white steps into the structure. The little door didn't have any kind of locks on it. I'd never been in any of these structures until this point, and I was incorrect in my assumption that they were mausoleums. I still don't know what the purpose of them were, maybe some kind of memorial building for deceased veterans in the cemetery. As I was inside that cold, dark structure, I could actually feel the hairs on my arms begin to stand up as I got goosebumps for reasons I wasn't sure of just yet. That buzzing sound was coming from inside of the structure, but it almost seemed like it was coming from beneath my feet.
Right, so you know what's going to happen. He's going to walk into the structure, he's going to be even more scared. He's going to do all the things that we as human beings just wouldn't naturally be inclined to do. How much are we betting, guys?
I looked down to the wood floor, and there were tiny round holes in each plank of wood, it seemed. Big enough to look through, but way too dark down there to see what lay below the floorboards. I had an idea. I positioned my phone on the floorboard just right so that the flashlight would shoot light into the hole in the wood, and I would look through one of the other holes. I lay basically flat on the floor with my head pressed up to the wood, one eye closed. I expected to see nothing at all, but I saw what appeared to be the top of a woman's head. and as if she knew I started
Oh,
looking
this is
immediately,
horrendous.
she looked up at me through the hole. I only saw her face for maybe half a second before I fell backwards and let out a blood-curdling scream. I sprinted back to the parking lot and called the guy who was supposed to relieve me soon, and I told him to meet me now. When he showed up, I tried to convince him that I was telling the truth about what I'd seen in that little building. He entertained me by coming with me to it, and I repeated what I did earlier with my phone flashlight. He looked through multiple holes but saw nothing. I had to check for myself, and
that
he was
is
right.
scary.
It was just some small, empty-looking space underneath the structure. I spent the rest of the shift with him. I left at 4 on the dot. I know he didn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me either. I'm sure it's a possibility that it was a hallucination as a result of my lack of sleep.
Yeah.
But I also believe it's a possibility that I witnessed a spirit or something completely supernatural.
I don't know.
I'd heard so many older Marines and veterans tell of supernatural experiences they had while serving. I don't know who the woman that I saw could have been if it truly wasn't my imagination, but it chills me to the bone to imagine it having been one of the women buried in the cemetery.
Right, guys, I think we've heard enough of that one. What do you think about the final one? I'm not too sure. I don't know if we're seeing things and stuff like that. Normally, there's a completely logical reason for you to see things or hallucinate, especially at night. Especially when you're fatigued. I've been so fatigued in the Marines at some points where, you're out on exercise for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. You're really, really tired. You've got to do stuff at night, so your eyes start playing tricks on you. You start seeing things that aren't there. And it's literally down to a couple of things: a lack of sleep and complete fatigue, guys, and the fact that you are operating at night. So, yeah, I'm not too... I'm not a believer, to be honest with you. But let me know what you thought in the chat, guys. Did you like that video? If you like that kind of content, let me know in the comments, and I'll start reacting to a little bit more scary stuff. But thanks for watching, and if you want to become a member, press the membership join button to support the channel further. But if you have already done that, I want to say thank you anyway, guys.